Right. Well, we are on 12 o'clock and we have got a sort of a tight timetable. We'll be finishing up bang on one. So I'm going to start. And first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you who've joined us so far. My name is Leslie Stevenson, and I'm the publisher of Governance Journal, which is sponsoring this, presenting this webinar. Delighted so many of you can join us. This is obviously a very challenging time for all sorts of organisations, but especially charities, which is why we've asked Helen and Patrick to share their extensive experience. They're going to have a conversation about the areas that they find to be most challenging in the charities they work with and the trends that they see coming along. We will be taking Q&A. If you could put questions into the Q&A rather than into the chat line, that would help, and I'll facilitate that as we go through. We're not going to stop for questions or have a hard Q&A at the end. It's going to be a very informal chat. We are recording the webinar, so we will be able to send it out to you on Monday probably, so that you can watch it again or send it to anybody you think might be interested. And I think that's all the logistics. So I'm going to hand over to Patrick and Helen to introduce themselves and then get into the meat of the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see people from all over the world, and a big wave for a friend from Nigeria. This is a big topic, but before we start, we thought we'd just do a very brief intro. So, Helen, would you like to go first?
Yes, thanks, Patrick. Hello, my name's Helen Baker. I've been working in charities and public sector governance for about 40 years now, in fact, chairing, setting up new bodies, but working across health, social care, housing and education. Current roles, my current formal roles are chairing Shelter, the board of Shelter, and vice chair of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing.
Brilliant. I mean, a ton of experience, and I know we've talked about lots of these sort of things before. Some of them are perennial and some of them are kind of more of the time. So my background very briefly is in business. I was on the operating committee of 3i, but also an experienced chair in the social space, both here and in Africa. I chair the EY Foundation and ESSA, which is Education Sub-Saharan Africa. So, Helen, let's kick off with one thing, and I guess we've seen overnight even another example of the kind of uncertainty and volatility in the sort of business and people's lives with the thing around electric cars. But this whole topic of how do we adjust to volatility, and how can we make ourselves more robust and resilient and able to cope when we don't necessarily have the huge financial strength that some other types of organizations might do. I mean, what's your take on all of that?
I think the fundamental thing is about being able to live with that uncertainty. It's a much less comfortable place to be. But I think fundamentally for boards, we now need to be far more agile and thoughtful, prepared to take different levels of risk, but be very, very clear now about organisational risk appetite. Hopefully pushing that risk appetite further, but actually spending time really working together on what that shared appetite is, but around a very, very clearly understood common purpose. I mean, in a sense, the more uncertain things are around us and the faster we have to move, the more important it is to remain absolutely anchored in terms of what the purpose is that's holding this organisation or this network or this movement together.
Yeah, and that sort of, what does this mean for our beneficiaries, just the general environment as well as the specific, how does this affect how we serve them? I guess the other thing I've seen, and I've written about this before, as many of you know on LinkedIn articles, is I think we've moved from what I call a maps world to a sat nav world in terms of the way boards take decisions, think about budgeting, think about making strategic decisions, and that's been difficult for some management teams, particularly finance teams who are not maybe tooled up for that or don't have the systems to support that, but also for some trustees in that it's kind of more straightforward to judge a management team if they're on or not on budget, if they're meeting the strategic milestones or not. It's much harder to do that in a dynamic budgeting sense. At both ESSA and in EY Foundation, we've adopted that kind of more dynamic approach with pretty good results so far, but it's not easy, and you need the right capabilities. I mean, what's your take on that one?
Yes, well, in fact, in lots of ways at Shelter, we've done very much the same, and it's thinking much more about. I mean, there are still people who are saying, "Where is your detailed business plan, and exactly where is the budget, and what does it look like?" And there are undoubtedly risks in terms of leaving more things open, but definitely within Shelter and other organisations that I'm involved with, we are trying to move much more to having a setting parameters. Some kind of very clear framework around what the decisions that organisations need to take. So, I mean, I've always said that I think governance itself is fundamentally about establishing very clear, proportionate framework around an organisation. You know, your values, your budget, your strategy, and so on. And if that is very clearly held and understood, but proportionate, you leave the space within that framework then for other people, and partly the board and the exec working together, but also actually right down to the front line, you leave the space for innovation and risk and new thinking. And in a sense, your concept of maps and sat-nav is exactly that. It's opening up a secure framework, but being prepared to take risk and think differently within that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly. I mean, the reason for that, I was actually stuck on the M6 one day when I had that sort of image, and I was sort of thinking about sat-nav quite a bit that day. But what struck me as well is actually, for it to work, you need the latest information and good information, and you need to be clear what are the criteria for turning left or right, and the weather has an impact, and you know the behavior of others has an impact, and all of that. So I think it's quite a good analogy. But you touched on something there which also I know you and I talked about a number of times, is around this, what the board does, what the exec do, that relationship between them, that clarity of authority. What's your latest thinking on that, Helen? Because I think, you know, people have shifted a bit since the pandemic.
Well, I think, interestingly, I think the pandemic encouraged the sense that the board and exec need to see each other as peers. So in a sense, it's two forms of leadership. Quite clearly, in an ultimate situation, the board carries ultimate responsibility and accountability. But what is really effective in terms of leadership is you can blend different forms, and exec and the board undoubtedly bring different perspectives, different knowledge, different experience. And bringing those together as a network of kind of peers with common purpose around a table does feel probably the most productive way to work together. But that does have to build on trust, and it does need a clarity of framework. What it needs is that everybody to come to the table as a peer, but with a clear understanding of what their actual formal role is. So I don't think at any point you can leave that the difference between governance and management out of the room. But it's stepping beyond that once you've actually established that and people are very comfortable and calm in those roles, because actually what you've got to be able to do is flex the boundaries.
Exactly.
It's different in big and large organizations, and you're going to flex a lot more in small organizations.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of agility that we're now needing to deliver does demand much more flex around those, being prepared to flex around those boundaries.
We've had a question, if I can interrupt, we've had a question from Jerry Brown, who's asking whether or not you think there's a crisis of board governance in the charity sector.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
what can be done to improve that?
What can be done about it? Can we cover that in just a moment? I was just going to finish the point on Helen, but thanks Leslie. So, I mean, one of the striking moments for me in COVID, to your point, Helen, was at the very beginning of it, when it wasn't clear how long this would last or how profound it would be. Myself and a group of, I think it was about eight chairs, had a call to, what are you doing about it? How are you seeing it? Which I often find incredibly helpful. And what we decided was actually that, I mean, a bit like, that Venn diagram thing I use a lot to say, one circle's the board, one circle's the exec, and the board is focused on making sure you got the right strategy, resources, and governance, assuming you got a good vision, and the exec are developing and delivering the strategy with input from other people, but they're doing that and maintaining financial operation integrity. And we were saying we thought that intersection between the two would bulge out a bit, and that there would be a need to provide both more oversight and more support through that phase. And actually, it's interesting, all of us kind of then went back to our sort of boards and teams and said, we need to think about how we are going to work together through this. And we adapted what was the way we were working before. And we also said, we need to adapt and recognize when we need to adapt again.
Yes.
So if this subsides, how do we do that? And that for me worked really well where I was chair. And I think that image of a sort of it's changing is probably quite helpful, and it's not too rigid. But to Jerry's question, I mean, what do you think, Helen? Do you think we've got a crisis of governance in the charity sector?
Interesting. There's been a fantastic report. I think, what's it called? Good Innovation or something. One of those organisations which has brought out a really, really interesting publication on the future of charities in 20 years' time. And to my disappointment, it's full of dynamic thinking until you get to the last chapter, which is all about governance. And it says that basically charity governance is completely broken, and it's the biggest barrier to the proper development and contribution of charities. Now, I don't think that is true at all. I mean, I think for a start, there are incredibly different boards working in different ways all over the place. So we can't all be wrong. I do think there's quite a lot of pushback. When under pressure, there was always a risk that there is just consistent pushback on to keep everything controlled and safe and overseen and held. And sometimes I think externally people see governance as being too much about the control and the holding. But I don't think it has to be. I mean, my sense of you control in order to let go, it seems to me a very good model of governance, but you cannot let go unless you have got good systems. And it's how organisations and external, media and government and general public look at charities and see the element of control. So the element of control, if it's well used, is something which is purposeful and enables innovation. But people get stuck on it's controlling and getting in the way, I think.
Yeah. I think boards have to sort of, ensure and add value. I mean, I don't think there's an overall crisis of governance. I think there's definitely a crisis in some charities, and I think just as many other types of organisations, there probably is these things are probably normally distributed, and there's the bulk of charities are probably doing a good job. There's some people doing a fantastic and an amazing job, and there's some people who really probably shouldn't be doing it. I think when you break it down, though, I guess is there something wrong with the structure? Is there something wrong with the way people are applying that structure, or are there some of the wrong people doing it? So that's the way I would view that. In terms of what can be done to improve the general state, I think what I'm seeing from some of the charities I've been helping with around the sort of board governance stuff is actually, I think there is a need for many charities to just reflect on, is our model of working, is the way the board works, is the way they work with the management team and so on, is that right for now? Yeah. Because there's been so much change, which we've just been exploring a bit on that. you know, it may have been right, but it's not right now, and it may not be right for what's coming. We've had a question in from PJ about, can you give us a specific example about the maps to SatNav? So yes, I'll give you an example from ESSA. So we are working on large systemic problems in African education. Our funding streams are mostly very large foundations. So our funding is quite lumpy. No matter what time of the year you might do the budget, there's always a couple of pitches out, or there's something like that. You may or may not get the money. In most charities of that nature, you can only use a certain amount of sort of project funding for covering core costs. So if you're in a growing organization and you're getting demand and your income is growing, but you know it's not all there yet, you have to kind of have a dynamic approach to budgeting. So the way we do our budgeting is, you know, these are the pitches we have. If we get this in by then we will do that. So our budget is based more on the conditions pertaining at a particular time than the time itself. The recruitment is based that way. So if we get more money in than we think, we accelerate investment. If we get less money than we get in, we delay in investment and so on. And that's a classic use of dynamic budgeting.
So I think there is an issue there, isn't there, between the difference in capacity to be agile between a small and a large organisation and a small and a large board, because sometimes those risks can be very, very substantial, the weighting on something. I mean, I think one of the challenges for boards is when trying to be agile and flexing across a year, you can set periods when you make decisions, but the data may not come in at the right time. Or what if something comes in towards the end of a year, which is quite significant, where you can't actually then haven't got enough time to adapt.
Yeah.
There is always that kind of risk. How far can we push it? So that sense that you were conveying, Patrick, of having decision points, known decision points, and review during the year at each stage. Where are we? How close are we to where we think we are? And so to an extent, it's almost more detailed because you're looking at the budget with much more question more regularly. But it does allow for much to be able to use data as it comes in, a new resource, new connections, new opportunities, much more flexibly.
It does. Well, we've gone 18 minutes without anyone mentioning the Charity Commission, but here we go, we've got one. So David Levinson said, are there just too many charities in the UK? Some 165,000 registered at the moment, compared with only 1,000 housing associations. I'm not sure why the comparison, but does this make it unrealistic for the Charity Commission to fulfil an effective regulatory role? Well, I feel you ought to go first on that, Helen.
Thank you very much. That's great. I mean, I think there really is an issue about the kind of proactive regulation. There really is a difficulty with the Charity Commission with the resource it has, because it can't really get out there proactively to set standards. I mean, it can set standards, it can talk, it can be visible, but it's really only ever got the capacity to react if something goes wrong. Which tends to give it the image of being pretty negative and constraining. Again, I think it's about establishing clarity about what's important. I mean, I love their one-pager about, what are the key 6 trustee duties for trustees. That feels really important, and actually it's there for boards and trustees and organisations to interpret and really challenge themselves about. So those resources, the capacity of the Charity Commission means that actually boards and organisations have to be much more proactive themselves. And I never think that's a bad thing anyway, that actually if boards are asking themselves the right questions about how effective are we, and are we using the right information, and are we dealing with safeguarding, and in a sense that if the organisation has stepped ahead it has much more control about the way it can express the controls it's choosing to use in its systems and respond to regulatory questions on its own terms, instead of having to jump into a regulatory box all the time.
Yeah. I'm going to skip on from that because the flow of questions is coming quite quick. So there's two here which I'll link together, and I'll start, Helen, and you add on this one, as you've kindly just done that one. So there's one around what's our view on the use of reserves, particularly in small charities, to enable necessary innovation and informed risk taking when funding stream is lumpy. So that's that one. And then another one from Ray Baker was why are there not more board donor-driven pushes for higher levels of financial transparency? Greater transparency should theoretically lead to greater donations. So I'll have a go at the two of them together. So on the first point for Caroline Hoare's question around reserves. So one way I think a lot of charity boards now are working, and we definitely do this. A good example would be the EY Foundation, which I chair, is that we basically have built up a good level of unrestricted reserves, and as a policy, we will invest a proportion of that each year, depending on, and some of that is absolutely around innovation. So we've just been doing a fantastic pilot of teaching primary school children in high poverty areas digital skills. Not many people would want to fund that straight away. We've funded the pilot, and it links to Ray's point in the sense of, I think, greater transparency. I think, charity accounts are charity accounts, but I think the bit that donors are more interested in is the bangs per buck bit of the transparency, not necessarily, the classic standard financial reporting. And actually, so I think this project we've done is quite a nice example of that, because we're able now to demonstrate with a relatively small amount of money you can actually have quite a high impact. So that's quite transparent, and then that now will enable us, perhaps we're just about the process of starting to get people to support that who probably wouldn't have done before. It took the use of unrestricted reserves to do that. So and if you've anything to add to that, Helen.
I agree that I think in terms of transparency, I think one of the things which donors and other stakeholders would least understand is charities sitting on reserves at a time like this. We're talking about this being a kind of perma crisis, and we're all facing all kinds of pressure. But at the same time, when you're facing pressure and risk, there are also emerging new opportunities. And actually, the whole point about reserves should be, of course, that it means that should you really hit a wall, then you can properly fulfill your responsibilities and meet your liabilities, and be responsible to staff and so on. But actually, reserves are also there, as exactly as you're saying, that it gives you that kind of longer term runway, where you can actually invest some unrestricted reserve in order to bring back a better return, or a longer term return which you might not otherwise achieve. And that's very much around being very responsive to different voices that we're hearing, and being able to make different choices and try things out. But it's also sort of being able to be in a sensible position if we hit with a crisis or something. It's so yes, I think reserves, the worst thing about transparency, the worst thing to do would be to be an organisation facing a really significant issues and trying to address them, but not taking any financial risk, and being very short term in terms of sense of control. But it is risky, because there are undoubtedly some very unexpected, very significant things which just jump out of the woodwork at you, and you can be in 1 year a charity can feel immensely secure and very mature and well organized, and then something just comes out of left field, and you can very quickly wobble. And those
you need to
are
do
also part of knowing that you can hold something safe during a wobble, or in the face of something unexpected.
Yeah, and one of the things I've tended to favour and been very happy to support CEOs in doing where I've chaired is actually, particularly when you're relatively small, is being bold and investing from unrestricted reserves in fundraising capacity.
Yes.
So I think that's just a great example of, because you're going to get assuming you don't make a wrong hire, you're going to get your money back, and actually then you're going to generate, yeah. So,
but in fact, I mean, what is interesting is that the cost of fundraising is going up because, of course, the cost of employing specialists is going up as it becomes more significant, and the costs of borrowing against that are also going up, and therefore that there's a kind of counterbalance to that, if you see what I mean. And there's always been talking about transparency, and if you're sort of saying how much you're spending on bringing in money as part of the way you use your income in your accounts, there has been a very traditional view that there's something wrong with that. That actually, because that's kind of core costs, and that somehow that's a misuse of funds. Is to spend
judgment,
money on
isn't
fundraising because it's too much money when you should be spending it on direct purpose.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance. Yeah, and I think the old kind of, you should keep 3 months in reserves. I mean, I think the world, it's much more sophisticated than that. You need to have a much better, because the type of funding will vary as well. And that old just matching your assets and liabilities classic way of thinking you need to bear in mind. Now we've had 3 or 4 new ones in. So one is around, is it a good time for charities who are not incorporated to reduce trustee risk by becoming a CIO? It depends. I think that's very general as a question. And CIO, community interest, is good for some and not so good for any. What is happening, I think, is that because of actually related to what we've just been talking about, there's many charities are trying to expand their commercial activities as a way of generating that unrestricted income, but that's not easy either.
No.
Yeah.
And some of that commercial, I mean, in some ways, that sort of the sort of commercial trading arms can in themselves be particularly risky, because they're sometimes moving charities into environments where they haven't really got sufficient knowledge, though they or other charities make enormously valuable use of them. I mean, interestingly, Shelter has 80, 90 shops around England and Scotland. And if you looked at them as a source of financial value, they certainly wash their face and they bring an income. But of course, the other thing is that as a trading arm, actually their real value is that they are a presence in local communities and a source of contact with the organisation and the community work which goes on from our shops and so on. So those trading arms, even something as apparently simple and financial as a trading arm, can actually have very substantial or different value that you need to take into account as well when working out their purpose or whether or not to invest in them. I think that, just going back to the thing about the CIO, I mean, I think at all points those things about addressing risk, the risk for trustees in tiny charities, that they may feel that they're much more vulnerable in a very volatile environment to being held individually accountable or being held legally accountable or whatever. But I suspect that incorporation is expensive and complicated, and that may not be proportionate or the best way to deal with it always. I mean, I think that's the issue. CIO is not a bad option because it does bring that incorporation, and in fact, it's probably the simplest structure and way to get that incorporation. But in practice, of course, much though it was intended to be a very easy vehicle to adopt, in practice it isn't. It was quite a lot of time and energy and negotiation and information provision. But I think it's that thinking about being very proportionate about that, because actually the risks for a trustee in a very small environment or a very small charity or something with a very clear, simple local purpose, actually in the end are much less.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well around, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around the cultural point, because what I've seen is actually, I suppose British Heart Foundation is a good example of this, because they also had a lot of shops, and they moved to they basically got, I think it was someone from B&Q or someone in to run it and it transformed the profitability.
Yeah.
But actually, to do that, you then have, different sort of cultures, and they, like you, use their shops a lot for, awareness raising, education, events, that sort of thing. And I think that's helped to sort of bind the culture together. But if you've got to have a successful commercial operation, you need people who can run successful commercial operations. And they're not always the same kind of characteristics and culture as the core charity. So managing that cultural aspect is interesting, I think.
Well, interesting. One of the things we do in Shelter, which I've having visited lots of shops this year, what we find, we attract a lot of managers who come from retail. Because one of the things that we're able to do,
and sorry, Helen, that's not just because a lot of them need jobs. It's
no. I mean, interestingly, what the distinctive thing about working in a charity setting, if you're working within that framework and leaving some space for people to manage and make decisions themselves, is a lot of our managers say it feels almost as if they're running their own shops, managing their own shops. They have it's flexibility with the framework again. So it's very, very clear. We've got tight controls and systems around what matters, but actually setting how the shop prioritizes and how it is in its local community and what you choose to do in terms of engagement and so on. So interestingly, you bring in very different skills, but then they blend into the bigger culture, because what there is an incredibly shared top level purpose, which is fundamental and drives people across the organization. It is that purpose and that passion which will allow you to blend all kinds of different cultures and different skills, if it's powerful enough and clear and simple enough, I think.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a good question here from David Levinson about, do trust boards take board effectiveness reviews as seriously as they ought to, and in fact is demanded in other regulated sectors? I think my view on this, David, is that I think, having done some board reviews and been on boards that have many boards that had board reviews, I think you could apply the same thing in regulated sectors as and business and charities. There's a massive variety. So I've turned down the offer to help someone with a view, because I didn't think they were going to take it seriously. I think they just wanted this year's stamp to say they'd done it. They weren't bothered at all. That was the impression I got. So why do you waste your time doing that? I do, however, and actually there are a couple of people on the call who may want to add in the comment who I've worked with on board reviews. There's one chair in particular, one I've done quite recently, is in the health sector, if that gives you a clue. I thought they were brilliant in terms of, they're actually doing a really good job as a board, but what they wanted was to do a better job. And actually, back to this point of, are they adapting quickly enough with it? So I've seen really negative thinking around this, and I've seen really, really positive thinking. I think where you get people who just want to say, we've done a board review, and they're more compliance focused than effectiveness focused, I think that gives you a clue. The ones who just want to do enough to keep the regulator happy, they're telling you the answer, aren't they? But Helen, you've probably got different.
I agree entirely. No, I think you've captured that entirely, because it is that thing. If it's just about compliance and ticking a box, then no. And I don't think that it's possible to say, does this sector take it seriously enough or not? I mean, it's the sector is so diverse that it's inevitably there's going to be some areas and some organisations and some parts of the system which are fantastically good at this, and others which aren't. But I mean, again, one of the issues is, as you put the system under pressure, that time for more generative, longer term strategic thinking can get squeezed out, and are we doing it well enough can almost feel like a ridiculous question. And this is one of the things that I think chairs need to do, is to keep that question at the forefront, and to insist on its importance, however big the distractions and the other pressures around us are, because that's the only way that boards are going to be strong enough and resilient enough and agile enough, really, to be taking the opportunities out there as well as just dealing with the risks.
Yeah, and I mean, another factor is actually, I think a lot of the people who do board reviews take a mechanistic approach, which doesn't actually help you get to the heart of it. So I think that's another feature of that. Can we move on to another topic, which I know is a sort of really one close to your heart, Helen, which is about, how do we keep getting the right people on the board? Because you've got your structure, you've got your way of doing it, you've got your terms of reference and committees and so on, but actually fundamentally, and it's the same in other spheres, it's all about getting the right people working together in the right way. And I think at the moment there are some tensions around availability and actually people's appetite to do trustee roles. I mean, I had an example the other day where actually it was I'm retiring from the EY Foundation chair role at the end of the year, and we were there was some feedback from the headhunters, and some people say, well, actually, no, I mean, I think it's just too demanding now to do a charity trustee role. And that asymmetry of fulfillment and the work and the risk has gone up. I mean, so there's a gap in the market, I think, for some roles. But what's your take?
Interesting. Somebody was saying the other day that actually, and what is happening is there's much more turnover in boards than there has been ever, really. I mean, it used to be you go on a charity board and you'd be there for the next 26 years, which was in many ways far, far worse. But I mean, now saying that, actually thinking about saying to somebody, there's 2-3 year terms, the chances of having somebody who's prepared to do more than 1 3-year term is actually is changing quite significantly. I do think there is I think that the trust in charities nationally is going back up again, but I think it was really pretty battered by the sort of
it's company time.
It's the relationship with government, and government sort of completely stepped away from charities and started flinging things at charities, too woke, to this, to whatever. So I and also media sort of jumping on when there were serious mistakes, but jumping on them and with very little understanding or reflection. So I think that really it is much more difficult to go out there and persuade people to come in and give their time. I've always been a believer that actually one of the ways to you've definitely got to think about what the rewards are for the individual. So it doesn't have to be paid, but I think there should be much more consideration of that as a possibility, some kind of honorarium to make it possible. I think it needs to be very, very clear. People really need to understand what the powers of governance are, not just what the responsibilities of governance are, but what it is possible to achieve for a cause that you really care about through good governance and having a role on the board. And it's about individual support and whatever. But it's also, I think, being seen to be very open, genuinely committed to increasing diversity. So going out to public advert and taking and being very, very clear in terms of what you're saying, that you really mean it, and then appointing against much more diverse criteria, which in itself produces then the risk that you're trying to get consensus from a network of people who are far more likely to have different opinions. And so the role then as a mediator becomes even more significant. But I mean, I think there is a challenge about, I think it's absolutely fundamental to the future of charity that we bring in far greater diversity and encourage people.
I agree with you. And I think the point around remuneration, I would say, is actually I think it does need a look at. Not, I mean, because you can always not take your fee, you can always donate it, but I think there are people who would be great trustees who can't do it because they can't afford. You know, they're basically turning away some paid income to do that, and therefore they can't do it. Or younger board members. You know, one of my hobby horses is, you know, I think we need much more, many more Horizon boards, many more younger people on boards in the sector. But we've got a really fantastic question here from an anonymous attendee, and I don't know if his chair is also on the call, but he's saying, how do you get rid of an underperforming chair? Or I have my own sort of favorite techniques here, but
well, I mean, it is clear that the chair has no more powers than any other trustee, unless they are given powers by the board. And so the chair is a member of the board, and the board appoints the chair. And I think it's being very clear about that, that the trustees are entirely responsible and you know, have the powers to take a chair out if they want to. If you see what I mean.
I think as well, I think if you become a chair, I think one of the most important appointments you're going to make is the chair of the nominations committee.
Yes.
And I think generally the chair of the nominations committee is often the person who sort of leads the work of the board review. You know, the chair is going to be ultimately responsible, but is also that person who is responsible for giving the chair feedback. Now, many years ago, actually just about 20 years ago, I was involved in something called a Higgs Review, which was a look at the governance of large listed companies. And we were the people who came up with the idea of a senior independent director. And it probably wasn't that well known at the time, but one of the reasons for that was that a number of big institutional investors were concerned that they thought, clear signals to chairs that they were getting a bit moldy and they ought to move on and well, that kind of thing, but they were not being listened to and they had no mechanism to bring about a change. So one of the things that we put in the senior independent director role was that, you know, that role. And I remember Derek, who sadly departed, very wise and very modest man. Derek said, but we must make sure that the senior independent director isn't a candidate to be chair.
Yes,
because that would keep them honest on it. And you have to say, you know, in PLC land, that has stood the test of trying to act well. And myself and a number of other people have been wondering lately whether actually a senior trustee role maybe ought to be more formalized, and part of the duty of that person would be to, you know, be that feedback route to the chair.
I'm not sure why you can't just use your vice chair. I mean, I think
yeah.
To an extent, I think sort of I mean, I can absolutely see the concept, and interestingly, we've just talked about it in a couple of contexts I've been in, whether or not there was a value of producing that very specific role, which is very specific currently to commercial sector, really, isn't it? And the answer was, it may be in the charity sector, it adds some complexity. And really the fundamental point is there somebody who is able to talk, is required to and able to talk to the chair continuously, and is actually most to the point, really, and I think this is often not done properly, but how does somebody annually do a full appraisal of the chair, so that there is an ongoing discussion which comes to a head every year. It's sort of focused every year, but there is an ongoing channel. So that kind of keeps that channel open throughout the appointment, that people can then feed back. It's not necessarily easy for people to feed back critique. But it's a bit like, you know, you've already got evidence of, I've already said this and we've already had this conversation, and a bit as an employment, you know, where is your evidence? What did you do? And show me how you tried to do something about it before you sack this person.
Or you're a good person, but you're just overboarding at the moment, and we need more time, and you're not really putting it in, and so on. I think PJ Davis has come back saying the fee question is an interesting one. Our induction session in June, so I think it's on the FT board director diploma, Murray Steele, I think, said you should never take a board position if you needed the money because it compromises your ability to resign. I think there's a difference between needing
any money that
money.
charity is going to give you is not going to compromise anything.
Yeah, I think it was in a business context, but also I think I found people are really interesting. And I know from my time in private equity, there's some people who'd invest a relatively modest amount of money in a company and act like they owned it. And they were sort of like, it would determine everything. And there were other people who'd invest, substantially more, but were absolutely prepared to walk away. So I think there's more variability in character around this. I think where I was talking about this was in people who, so for example, Elite Confronting Conflict, which I chaired for many years, we would put young people on the board. And in them being on the board, they were not doing part-time work to do that. So it was costing them to be on our board, and we were not allowed to pay them under the Charity Commission guidance. We also had, and actually the Charity Commission were really good around this issue. We had some of our young trainers who were freelance trainers, so they didn't only train Philippe, who we thought might be good board members, as they went through the process. And literally, you wouldn't be able to pay them for training. So the Charity Commission actually said, no, you can't pay people for their trustee duty, so you can pay them. So I thought the Charity Commission were really very reasonable about that.
Interesting, in other sectors, money is meaningful. It is quite significant. For example, the FT non-exec program. You can see in the commercial sector, A, it's well paid, very well paid to be a non-exec, and B, it has a status. It's seen as something which is there to be achieved towards the end of a career or middle end of a career when you're senior enough to consider it. And the money against that is only one element, but it is an element which gives some sense of status, and this is something of value. This is something which is important. So I'm not talking about, it's perfectly clear that boards should always reimburse any expenses and, covering caring costs and et cetera. But I also think there is something symbolic about there being no money at all attached to charity trustee roles. And it tends to come with, that would undermine the ethos of the sector, which is almost... it almost makes it sort of undermines the significance and strengths of the trustee role, and it also almost implies that governance is not it's not secure. You can only ensure that you have good trustees if you don't give them the temptation a bit of money. And I just think it's only one of those things, and I agree entirely. You wouldn't pay everybody, and it would only be an honorarium, but the fact that there is nothing and it's so difficult to do, I just think where we're asking organisations to flex and make decisions and think about the changing environment they're working in, that's just one of the things that charities should have a right to consider as an opportunity.
Agree. There's another really good anonymous one, which I'll pick up because this is really, really close to my heart. So thanks for comments on board diversity. To what extent do you think it's been lacking in and has fed into some of the failures we've seen recently in some charities? I think it's interesting. At EY Foundation, we've been doing quite a lot of work on this very topic. How do we get more diverse, not just on boards, but actually in charity teams? And so we actually set up a program. We did this with Prospectus to look at can we get because actually work experience in the charity sector is usually not very well organized, not very well done, and actually often doesn't allow access to young people with poorer backgrounds. So we've focused on young people with free school meals or are care experienced, and we've actually got a formal program for charities to get them, first of all, into the charity doing work experience, internships, that sort of thing. and then keep in touch with them so that they can be employed later. So that's a long-term kind of thing. I think the diversity on charity boards is very variable, like many other things, and there's been quite a lot of progress. The variability, or the sort of elements of social diversity that are missing are the social diversity and the disabled. I think those two. I think there's been more progress on gender and race, not enough, some would say, but I think there's been virtually minimal progress around disability or social diversity, and disability in charities that aren't disabled, focused on the disabled. I'm talking about there.
Yeah, and actually, I think that throws up the other really big challenge to us as a system is individuals with experience of whatever it is that the charity is campaigning around, organised around, committed to. And I think there's been very considerable progress in lots of ways. There's a much clearer, it's a much more explicit and unavoidable expectation that the voice of people with the experience, or that your beneficiaries or whatever, will have a far stronger voice in terms of not just coming into events, but actually helping to shape strategy and set priorities and provide the voice for campaigns and so on. Actually, that's another interesting challenge to boards, is to think about whether it's a good thing to bring people directly with experience onto the board, who would then technically have conflict of interest or not, whether you set up a sort of parallel governance function, whether you start from the top and bring people onto the board as a matter of principle, or whether you start at the bottom and encourage engagement at the bottom and then help that organically grow through the organisation until it reaches the board. I mean, it does feel a very defining value for the sector now, even if we're not necessarily consistently good at delivering against that.
And all of those are great things to do, and some people are doing all of those things. And you've got to resource that properly as well to do it. So if I think of the youth advisory boards where I've been involved in, you've really got to dedicate resource to that. And you've got to support those people in that. And the model we have at EY is quite good, because we have a youth advisory board, and then we have the chair and the vice chair of that sit on the main board. So we've got that connectivity and that diversity. Now we've probably got time for one more before we wrap up. And Zena has asked the question: can you talk about board evaluation in the case of charities? So, I mean, just to kick this off, I mean, I think a simple approach, a straightforward approach, is to think about purpose, people, and process. So, are all the roles clear? Is the role of the board, the role of the exec, are they working together in the right way, and so on? Have you got the right people, and are they working together in the right way? And then the process stuff is, everything from, are they having the right things on the agenda? Have they got good board papers? What's the process for making decisions? Or selecting people? All of that kind of thing. So then I've always found that purpose, people, process, structure is a good way to think about the effectiveness of the board. And then I think there's great value in having an independent view. I think there's some of those things you can do yourself. I think the compliance bit, you can do a lot of that yourself and then get someone to look over that. So you can take some of the cost out of doing it in that way if you've got someone who's providing good sort of a governance sort of function for you. And I think the bit that's missing often is people do a review that's inward looking. They don't look at, so how does that fit with the characteristics of high performing boards everywhere else at the moment? So we might be good in the way that we think of it, but actually, are we using technology in the best way for our board? Lots of other boards are doing some great stuff on that. Are we engaging the beneficiaries in as good a way as other people? So there's a sort of, not in a kind of classic formal benchmarking way, but there's something around, are we up with the pack, and where do we want to be? But Helen, what's your
I was just going to say, actually, there was just one thing I wanted to drop in before we get to the end of this. And it is interesting thinking about that, because to an extent, we've been thinking more inwardly about boards and relatively conventionally about boards of single organisations. And I do think that we can't have a discussion about the pressures on boards and the opportunities for boards without thinking about boards within much wider systems.
Yeah.
And boards as conveners and collaborators and facilitators of other people's voice and whatever. And I think this is a whole other topic, but I think to an extent we've demonstrated the risk for boards is that we look inwards and look at the way that we function internally and as individual boards, whereas actually the excitement and the opportunity, and I think the necessity at the moment, is for boards to look way beyond each organisation and to regard themselves as a resource in a wider ecosystem of impact, which I think is a great concept. So I just wanted to drop that in because I think it's always important that boards look out at the bigger opportunities as well as quite properly ensuring that how we function within our own organisations is adding maximum value to the purpose that we're trying to deliver.
Yeah. We've got 2 questions left, which I don't think we're going to have time to answer. I'll just say what they are very briefly. So one is it right or wrong for board members to be charged a particular amount of money by the management of a charity to support the activities of the charity? Easier for it. I mean, yeah, both of us have got the same facial expression is probably the answer there. And the other one is, what role do you think technology can play in helping charity boards navigate uncertain times? I think significant. But there's also significant risk in thinking you can delegate to technology or that technology is some magic wand. I think the board apps are a great way of improving board efficiency and supportive, therefore, of effectiveness if you get the right ones and you use them well. But yeah. So I think we probably need to hand back to Leslie to close, because we did promise we'd let everyone off by 1. So Leslie.
Thank you very much, Patrick and Helen. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. I don't know if you've seen various comments have been coming in through the Q&A session saying thank you and how insightful it was. We did prepare, obviously, for this webinar, and Patrick and Helen have had a couple of conversations just between themselves about what's relevant and what the challenge is. And I think it's really interesting that so many of the questions have inadvertently fed into the things that you both identified as real challenges. So I'd like to thank everybody who's attended for your thoughtful and insightful questions. Really like to thank Patrick and Helen for being so open and sharing their huge experiences. We will be getting back in touch with you. JP, I think, asked about the maps to SatNav, and you did pick up on that in the session, Patrick. But I think we'll also send people a link to your LinkedIn article, because I think that people find that useful. So we will be sending out a follow-up email probably on Monday with the link to the video recording. And we'll send the link, it will include the link in that. Really, it's coming up to 1 o'clock. I'm going to let you all go. Just to say thank you to everybody, and just absolutely fascinating session. Thank you.